We can start now.
Okay, we can start now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, we're live now. A pleasant day, everyone. Welcome to the Innovate for Cities Conference 2021. I am Louis Posadas, and I will be your moderator for this session. I am from the Philippines in Southeast Asia, and I work for Tampei for nearly 6 years now. Next slide, please. Tampei, it stands for Technical Assist. Next slide, please. It stands for Technical Assistance Movement for People, Environment, Incorporated. We are a group of young technical professionals, mostly in the fields of architecture and planning. As community architects, we work closely with urban poor groups in attaining tenure security through a number of community-led approaches, such as participatory site development planning, housing design workshops, and other capacity building activities. Since 2010, the year when Tampay was established, we have been supporting the Homeless People's Federation Philippines Incorporated, or HPFPI, and its networks in their land and housing needs. Now, given this seemingly never-ending issue of land and housing tenure and security, coupled with the current challenges brought about by climate change, which has been further worsened by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, our team in Tampei initiated a qualitative action research centered on documenting and building on the various resilience strategies being implemented by selected HPFPI member communities in the country. Now, our theme for this session is very much connected with the current work of Tampei and one of our partners, the UN Habitat Philippines. Next slide, please. So this parallel session entitled Planning for Resilience with Vulnerable Communities in the Philippines will tackle how disadvantaged groups in the country, primarily with emphasis on the urban poor sector, have been affected by and are adapting to climate change by, say, highlighting their community-based disaster risk reduction or CPDRRM initiatives, especially now with the added context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the social capital created by these urban poor groups and their other forms of locally led adaptive mechanisms are further supported by city level and national level resilient and green recovery or RGR plans to attain a more macroscopic view on how we can plan for a better and greener future. Okay, so for today, we will be joined by two young and enthusiastic speakers from the Philippines who shall talk about their respective institutional experiences with regards to the concepts and practice of planning for resilience. So after the two presentations, we shall entertain questions from the audience, or you may also key in your questions in advance in our chat box. Okay, so going straight to our presentations, let me introduce you to our first speaker. Next slide, please. So our first speaker is my colleague in Tampei. She acts as our communications and research officer. With her background in social sciences in area studies from the University of the Philippines, Manila, she was able to handle two related researches. One of which is the adaptive capacities research led by Tampei in 2020, and another a rapid research on resilient and green recovery or RGR with UN Habitat Philippines in 2021. As a fellow advocate, she aims to amplify the voices of the marginalized sector and to share their stories and experiences with her documentation work. So now, sharing the results of Tampei's adaptive capacities research, session participants, let us all welcome Aya Santos. Aya?
Hello. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So hello, good day to all the participants. Thank you for taking time to attend our session. So as Sir Louis has introduced, I'm Aya Santos. I'm from Tampei. So today I will be discussing Tampei's research on the adaptive capacities of the urban poor communities during the COVID-19 pandemic and other disasters. This research was done with the support of the Global Land Pool Network and the Community Architects Network. So here, there. Next slide, please. Okay, so the objectives of this research is to capture the current conditions in the communities given their varying contexts. Also want to build on the existing coping mechanisms as their immediate response to the pandemic, and to co-create possible solutions in community planning that factor in the safety measures needed to be implemented during the pandemic. These are the two research questions that we wanted to be able to answer. How do the urban poor adapt to the current realities in relation to attaining the better normal? And in terms of action and policy, what can we learn from them, and how can we build on or support their grassroots experiences and initiatives? So next slide, please. Yeah. So we did uh, 8 different case studies in 8 different communities in all over the Philippines and different islands of the Philippines. So mainly the Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And uh, in this map, those with the solid icon, the solid black icon, these are the communities with land security, or they already own the land that they live on. And the outlined icons, so the hollow icons, these are the communities that they're made up of informal settler families, so they don't own the land that they live on. These communities were selected based on their differing contexts and their membership with our partner the Homeless People's Federation Philippines Incorporated, or the HPFPI. So next slide, please. In terms of data collection, our data gathering was conducted from September to December of 2020. When we collected the data, we followed these 4 steps. So first, we did community profiling, where we looked at the location, the number of households, the land tenure status, among other relevant data needed for this research. And after doing the initial community profiling, we conducted focus group discussions where with guide questions to better understand the context of the case communities. Third, after this, we did the initial drafting of case study, which we then presented during the validation session. Aside it from being a validation session, it also served as a presentation of the results of the case studies to the community. Tampei and its partners conduct validation sessions as a way to make the research a more participative process instead of merely extracting data from the communities. Next slide, please. So this is the framework that we followed in order to identify the themes that we wanted to focus on with this research. So this framework, we can see that the urban poor, they face these 4 current realities, and by integrating strategies, the the strategies, approaches, theories, and philosophies found in the third column, in partnership, as you can see, with the government and NGOs, we can new collective vision of a new and better normal, and having sustainable cities can be formed. So next slide, please. These are the 7 themes that we covered in this research, but the next slide, please. The we in With the conference focusing on environment and climate change, and also in the interest of time, since this is a pretty long research, we will be focusing more on these 3 themes, namely the food security, disaster resiliency and climate justice, and tenure insecurity and inequalities in public space planning. So in the next part, when after or while discussing each theme, Tampei's recommendations will be given, and these recommendations can range from the individual level up to the national level, and they can include both short-term and long-term recommendations. So next slide, please. So we go to the first theme, disasters and climate resiliency. So next slide, please. So here we can see these are some of the effects of the flooding and sea level rise that we found as we were collecting data. So one of the case communities is perennially submerged underwater. Its location is below sea level, and they experience land subsidence caused by the over extraction of groundwater from nearby built up areas and flooding due to sea level rise. 2 other case communities experience flooding threat due to their proximity to large bodies of water. With the Philippines frequently experiencing typhoons, which are getting stronger and stronger each year, the floods get worse and worse each year. Another case committee experienced flooding during heavy rains due to their location being at a relatively lower elevation in the area. With factories surrounding it, all the drainage from the factories flows down to their area, and adding that we add the poor drainage system to that, flooding becomes inevitable in their community. So next, please. Another one. Another one of our case committees, they also experienced a series of earthquakes in 2019. This caused trauma in some of the members where they live. So one of the ways that they coped with this is they lived in makeshift tents. Even months after the earthquakes, they were very hesitant to move back to their homes due to their due to being scared of possible future earthquakes and their houses falling in on them. In 2000, one of the case communities that we covered, they used to live as scavengers around the landfill. Due to poor management of the landfill, that year it eventually collapsed during the houses of the residents surrounding it. So they have now relocated to another area outside of the city where they were able to buy the land. So next slide, please. Another one of the risks that that the case communities face is our industrial and fire hazards. So this is again the community that I referred to that we're surrounded by factories. So these factories it poses industrial hazards to them, and because of high density and tangled electrical wires, fire hazard is it poses as a fire hazard. The tangled electrical wires are very prone to sparking due to the friction between the wires with the insulation wearing down, and it causes shorting, especially during the rainy season. Next slide, please. So as a response, they have fire watch volunteers, which have been equipped by the city government. They are also currently undergoing a reblocking of their community, but this has been temporarily paused due to lack of funds caused by the unemployment brought about by the pandemic. They have also built their homes up with second and sometimes third floor levels as an adaptation to floods. Lectures on climate change adaptation are given, as well as having clear disaster risk reduction and management plans. Um, the residents in the community submerged underwater have developed techniques for easy assembly and disassembly of houses due to the floods and strong typhoons that they experience. So they build their houses out of light materials. Because water gets cut off during typhoons, they have also partnered with an NGO to create a rainwater harvesting facility in their community, which have solar panels, and these solar panels can also be used in case of electricity brownouts. Next slide, please. Another one of the disaster responses is the community I mentioned before, who used to be scavengers. They now live in a hilly area outside of the city. Due to their community being located on a slope, they conduct tree planting to manage the soil erosion. Their houses are also built to adapt the sloping landscape with reinforced foundations. Strong storm drainage systems were put into place, and they gather as a community to clean the drainage systems regularly. Next slide. Another one is due to the trauma caused by the earthquake, psychosocial support was given. And in line with this, due to the adverse effects of the pandemic on people's mental health, case community, one of our case communities, they partnered with a local university and an NGO to conduct mental health webinars. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of the impacts and responses that I discussed in the previous slides. There is an increased awareness for the environment, reassessing policies, and the communities. And the communities, like they really come together in times of disasters. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are just some recommendations from Tampei. So it's important to increase the government budget allocation for disaster risk and reduction management. There's a need to recognize pandemics and other health-induced hazards as evolving forms of disaster. It's important to promote community-based DRRM by empowering community members and integrating grassroots structures, and support community-led upgrading projects relative to DRRM and climate change adaptation. So next slide, please. Now we go to urban gardening for food security. Urban gardening is one of the it, it it's an adaptation that a lot of people have taken up in to to better to improve their food security. So next slide, please. So we can see the different forms of urban gardening in different communities. So it's important. They usually use open spaces, and the produce of these urban gardens are used for daily consumption and for weekly feeding programs in one of the case communities. And it's also important for they also plant fruit bearing trees, so it just adds to the edibles that they're able to plant. Another one of our communities, they do rooftop gardening. They Because of their coastal location, they are able to harvest clams as well during the low tide. The produce of these communities are sold in mobile kiosks along the highway. So there. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the vertical gardens. They were done. Um, these are done in the community that's submerged underwater. So because there's no dry land, what they did was they went up. They did vertical gardening. They used empty soda bottles, old soda bottles, and uh, put soil in them and planted their vegetables there. Next slide, please. There. So here, we in the community who experienced the series of earthquakes, uh, they were able to use the open spaces as a sort of evacuation area during the earthquake. So since it's open space, there are no buildings that can fall. That's where they went um, during the earthquake and while waiting for the aftershocks to pass. These are also used to maintain sanity and to combat boredom. So a lot of people who lost their jobs, they didn't really have anything to do, so they it became productive. It became a source of it they used their time to plant food. Another one of our communities who live beside a lake, they planted water spinach, or what we call kangkong, along the shores of the lake. And another one of the case communities who live around the prison compound, they are an informal settler they're informal settlers, and they were able to make use of an old pool to also plant kangkong. And so we can see that open spaces are not just the dry land that we as we know it, but also water bodies can also be used as open spaces and can be productive. So next slide, please. So here are some impacts. This just summary again. So there's a greater appreciation for the agricultural sector. Food security is more stable, at least on the individual and the community level. And the produce serve as an alternative source of income, and home gardening as becomes a form of stress relief. Next, please. So some recommendations. So it's again important to support community level, grassroots level initiatives, such as the community level markets, the community kitchens. In terms of physical planning, it's important to allocate an open space for development projects, and the conversion of agricultural land and residential land should also be carefully balanced, because there are a lot of communities who are applying for land conversion from agricultural to residential. But it's also something that we have to take into account, the balance, because we need our agricultural land for food security, but people also need a place to live in. So it's something that can be considered. So next slide, please. So because we focused on urban poor communities, tenure insecurity and inequalities in public space planning cannot be ignored. Um, this is one of the main issues that they face even before the pandemic happened. Next slide, please. So here some inequalities that we noticed while we noticed while we were doing the data collection. Um, so we have the stay-at-home policy, but given that given that many of the members of the communities, their job requires them to most of them work in the service sector, and the service sector requires them to be present physically at their jobs. You cannot be a waiter and do it work from home, and so that's one of the issues that we encountered while we were collecting data. And as well as there are still some communities, even at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic last year, where they were being forcefully evicted and their homes demolished. And it it's 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 quite the opposite of what it's being asked of them, where they're asked to stay at home but they have no homes to speak of. Also, the physical distancing measures, many are or live in high density settlements, and so physical distancing, as much as they try to adhere to it, it's hard because of the lack of space in general. So we have public transportation, which is suspended, which was suspended and is now limited. Many of the committee members, they rely on public transportation to get around, but they don't have private cars. So it's it's one of the challenges that they really had to figure out how to work around it. So next slide, please. So as I've mentioned before, they experienced threats of eviction and demolition. And the earlier this year, one of the communities that live around the prison compound, they were relocated to an in-city relocation site provided by the Bureau of Corrections. And usually, when we talk about in-city relocation, it's preferred by people because of its proximity to the basic services. But this in-city relocation site where they were brought to was is dry, is bare land. So as you can see in the middle picture, there really isn't anything there. There aren't any drainage systems, there aren't any water systems, even electricity isn't available. So they really have to start from the ground up. And so right now they're focusing on the sewage systems. So that's what they're currently doing. Next slide, please. So these demolitions, they were carried out by the government, mostly because many are in the way of proposed public development, such as roads. And but there's one community who had the demolition. They were many of the houses were demolished, and some members did not qualify for relocation, so they were not able to move away. And those who were left, they're financially unstable because to qualify for relocation, I think they needed to have they need to have a certain amount of income. And so the reblocking project, I mentioned it already, but yeah, this reblocking project has been halted. For the they also face lack of green and open spaces, again because of their settlements being high density settlements. Next slide, please. So some lessons learned. So the Philippines has a Balik Probinsya program, or a program where the people are encouraged to return to the provinces. Metro Manila will one of the effects of this is that Metro Manila will be decongested, um, but then and the growth will be redistributed to the municipalities, but this can be it's not necessarily effective as long as development of the provinces and outside of Metro Manila, the capital is not it's not there's no holistic development of these places, of the provinces that the government is encouraging people to go to. So there is also a need for public parks in Greece. Public parks are very scarce and are often being privatized. So you usually need to pay an entrance fee to be able to make use of these parks. Housing laws are also important to look at because homes are first lines of defense against the virus. They basically serve as an emotional sanctuary, and again, social distancing is not applicable in high density settlements. Next slide, please. Six. Some recommendations is it's important to create jobs in the countryside to sustain the returning population, especially with uh, with 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 everyone moving back to their parents' homes and everything. So it's also important to advocate for the institutionalization of the and implementation of the local shelter plan. We need to revisit the laws to accommodate emerging design needs, especially on informal, socialized, and economic housing. Um, it's also good to look at the slow road concept by integrating MSMEs in street design, and to highlight the importance of pedestrians and alternative modes of mobility. So instead of using private cars to get everywhere and with limited public transportation, it's good to highlight. It's good to consider these alternative modes of mobility, such as bike lanes and just walking also. So there. Next slide, please. So this concept of um, sorry, I lost. Hello. Nine.
Hello. Yes, we hear you.
Yes. Oh, okay. Okay. So this concept of bayanihan and accountability. So bayanihan is a Filipino term for it basically it's an activity where the community comes together to work on something that will help everyone. So it has origins from when before houses were made out of bamboo. They you could transfer it's a mobile house. You could transfer it. You could just carry it basically. And bayanihan would mean um, would imply that everyone from the community would help this one individual um to move. And so that's where the concept of bayanihan comes from, the collective activity of a community. And um so there. Next slide, please. Okay, so so in terms of citizen participation, when we look at social accountability, there is an increased awareness on the difference of good governance versus the way of traditional politicians. So usually, the politics of the Philippines is very it's very complicated, and a lot of people now are focusing more on um, well, uh, uh, more people are focusing on on the good governance instead of focusing uh, on on personality politics. So also there's also an increased awareness in on people's rights in terms of healthcare, environmental policy, and disaster governance, and tenure rights. So citizen participation. So this is an active involvement in discussions and current events via different platforms, especially social media. A lot of people have started to use social media more because since we're not allowed to see to see people face to face, a lot of people have used social media uh, to, to maintain the connections that they have, the social connections that they have, and in using the social media, um, there the discussions and current events are more um, are it's more distributed. A lot of people, when before social media, for people who use social media, it's usually just the middle class and maybe the the those who earn a bit more from the lower class. But um, because now a lot more people use it, so the distribution of information is has been a lot of people, even government agencies uh, maximize the use of social media now. So when we look at social capital, citizen participation, where public and private support is lacking, social capital, and especially among the urban poor, it has proven crucial to responding and rising above the inequalities brought about by demolitions, disasters, and diseases. So next slide, please. So here are just some of the general findings. So of this research. So communities with secure tenure, they display higher levels of organization and success in the pandemic responses. This is mainly because they don't have the issue of they don't have to take time to look for land, because many of the communities who are informal settlers, um, what another men most of their time is taken up by looking for possible land that they can acquire, and or processing the papers for this land acquisition process. But these committees with secure tenure, they can focus more on their pandemic responses. Organizational maturity is reflected also in the way that the committees responded to pandemic. So many of those are who are well organized, many of the communities who are well organized have relatively more comprehensive pandemic responses as compared to those who are not organized as much. So because usually it's just the homeowners, it's just the association president who's doing most of the work. External stakeholder relationships put people-led initiatives to a greater scale. There's also an emphasis now as well on the people-led initiatives. So next slide, please. So there, just in conclusion, in today's so Tampay, along with its partners, can provide additional support, demonstrate that the community-driven development is possible, and uh, Bayanihan and Filipino resiliency both play a key role in pandemic and disaster response. But this doesn't mean that because the people are doing well with their individual and community responses, that the government doesn't have a mandate anymore to provide the basic services, because the reason why the communities have these initiatives is because they don't get that kind of support from external sources, and so they they find ways uh, to adapt on their own. And in on in terms of the new and better normal, so in today's context, adjusting to the new normal, it means individuals and communities and institutions building so these three groups, they build the resilience, they help each other build resilience amidst the challenges of the pandemic. So that's it. Next slide, please. Thank you. For a deeper look into these case committees, you may download the PDF of the iShould 2021, where the case studies that I mentioned are discussed in greater detail. And the stories told here, they remind us that attaining tenure and security is just a stepping stone to achieving the greater goal of having safe, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable cities, towns, and communities. So the road to new and better normal does not end merely by acquiring land and housing for tenure security. It doesn't end there. It's just the start of yet another complex and challenging process of community-driven development that encompasses thematic areas including health and sanitation, livelihood, food security, education, technology, social programs, and the environment, among others. So that concludes my presentation, and I hope you were able to get something out of this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Aya, for the presentation. So for those who are already familiar, it gave us a refresher on the multitude of challenges being faced by urban poor groups in the Philippines. And for those who are new to the Philippine context, I hope it gave an overview, a good overview, and a good starting point for discussion. Nevertheless, the presentation, it emphasizes the importance of here, strong social networks and tenure security as forms of resilience. No? For the urban poor, it's their collaborative action against evictions and demolitions. It's their collective adaptation to climate change, and it's their shared resilience amid the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which for us in Tampay, we believe that social capital, it must be supported to attain scale and sustainability. Now, speaking of support, we are to hear a presentation on the collaboration between local actors, and the city government in planning for resilience at the city level. So our next speaker is an urban planner and is currently working as city coordinator of UN Habitat Philippines. His planning practice focuses on mainstreaming sustainability to spatial and development planning, increasing community participation in planning process, and promoting natural and nature-based design solutions in urban infrastructure projects. He is now working on projects that optimize risk assessment methods to inform COVID-19 socioeconomic recovery and climate resilience planning, and the localization of city plans and actions to reduce marine litter. With his presentation entitled Understanding COVID-19 Impacts and Approaches to Resilient and Green Recovery, the case of Ormoc City, Philippines, let us all welcome Mr. Ben Aguijón. Sir Ben?
Thank you, Louis and Aya and the rest of Tampay team. Very comprehensive discussion of Aya on adaptive mechanism developed by the urban poor. For my presentation, next slide, please. I will be presenting Ormoc City's effort to address the combined risk of climate change and pandemic through designing or redesigning our built environment to propel socioeconomic recovery that underscores the need to realign our efforts in resilient and green development framework and trajectory. These materials are part of the Building Climate Resiliency through Urban Plans and Designs project, jointly implemented by the UN Habitat in the Philippines and the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development. Next slide, please. For this presentation, we will be navigating an introduction of our KCP or Ormoc City, its spatial and socioeconomic development gaps and opportunities, the interplay of climate change, the current pandemic, and the pursuit of development, the capacity building efforts of the B Group D project to forward resilient and green recovery, and some practical design approaches from the ongoing design sessions in our case city. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Ormoc is a coastal city located northwest of the Leyte Island and old Spanish settlement, and a component city since 1947. It is a regional center, a gateway of the Eastern Visayas region to the rest of the Visayas Island, and it envisions to be a center of agro-commerce, industry, and renewable energy of the country. In recent years, it is accommodating a fast pace of investments in business, commerce, housing, while pushing its development gaps to close its development gaps on employment and housing informalities. Next slide, please. Its spatial development strategy suggests that its major nodes pick up from the existing structures that dictates its land use on tourism, industrial use, agriculture, utilities and transportation, and in settlements in varying degree of urban sprawls. And its major node of development is still the old urban core of the Ormoc Bay, where the key development projects will expand northwest of this node of development. Next slide. Of its total land area of about 46,000 hectares, the built environment is detected in 8.23%, and this includes around 0.24% of public and open spaces. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The city's climate risk assessment suggests that flooding in the urban center and its production areas will affect 71 villages, and this will lead to destruction of settlements and public infrastructures. While the informal economy, those working in public transportation and those vendors in daily subsistence will receive no income on top of being affected by the flood. The city will have an additional of about 220 millimeter of rainfall, and flood is the most impactful risk in the city, as it is experienced in 1991 with Typhoon Uring or Telma, and in 2013 with the Super Typhoon Yolanda or Haiyan. Next slide, please. On the other hand, increasing temperature will impact the living and working conditions in housing and building units. Concrete materials and designs without passive cooling will build the dense built-up area already in the urban core, and the area with its development strategy will continue to accommodate these types of structures if not regulated. The city's temperature will increase about 2.3 degrees Celsius. Next slide. In terms of greenhouse gas emission, the city accounted in 2017 about 151,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is highly emitted from the still-wide practice and land utilization of agriculture, while electricity use, which is mainly urban, accounts for 36%, and its current forest cover can sequester about 35% of the total emissions. Next slide. This is the citywide risk assessment of the city. The west area, its production zone, is at risk to flooding. The east side, where forests and upland are located, are at risk to rain-induced landslide, while the urban center is at risk to flood and is under heat stresses. Note that on extreme cases, some same areas in the urban center are also at risk to storm surges. And next slide, please. And now, taking on the impacts of the current pandemic, the greatest hits remain to be confined in the urban area. We can see that 63 of cases are those residing and working in the urban areas, and about 15,500 workers are displaced. 438 businesses decided to close. And when we need sufficient housing and access to water for our isolation, quarantine, and hygiene, there are 25,000 of the population, which still needs to be serviced with pipe water system, and 3,147 families still residing on inadequate housing units. These are all on top of climate trees, of flood, and rising temperature. This pandemic highlights the need of public and open spaces for health activities, provisional spaces for our basic services, and even safer mobility and transport. But this remains low and sporadically located, missing its role as part of the public sphere. Next slide, please. In an impact study implemented by the UN Habitat in partnership with Tampei, as mentioned by Aya a while ago, there are key top-line issues that we have to include in the city realities that need to be addressed. First, the inaccessibility of health services. This is aside from the low-seeking behavior of the people. And number two, it is not only on work displacement, but also the rising household debts. Three, the shift on mode of delivery. For example, in education and high reliance now on the virtual space and the internet. Our inaccessibility to food and formation of unhealthy responses like skipping meals, and limitation on mobility, not only on the health concern, but also the costs required to facilitate it. While we understand that vaccination is the key solution, the social and economic implications are also important issues that we have to tackle. It is good to note that there is high level of awareness on COVID-19 transmission and preventive measures, which can set the tone of high community participation in developing innovative solutions to continue working, traveling, and doing our outdoor activities. Next slide, please. Zooming in into two major concerns that is highly related to urban design. On adequate housing, we can see that there is 75% of the urban poor surveyed that do not have the sufficient space for their isolated family member. Assuming that the country situation will continue for at least next 2 years, public funds used to operate isolation centers will continue to compete on their investment priority of the city. In Ormoc, they catered around 25,000 repatriating individuals who are needing these isolation spaces before they integrate back to their homes or households. On public and open spaces, 85% of the urban poor surveyed suggested the importance of open spaces. The pandemic asked us to stay home and slow down, but every now and then we need to go out to work, exercise, and do our markets. Thus, the need for our roads, sidewalks, terminals, and parks to be sufficient in space and to be accessible to us. This is a time to rethink of housing units and the public and open spaces that address these kinds of public health situation. Next slide, please. But addressing the pandemic is also an opportunity to heighten our climate actions. As we redesign our new roads, systems, and parks network, our houses and buildings, climate adaptation and mitigation benefits should be remain constant and overarching. For example, designing parks for our physical exercises can be designed as also catchment of rainwater that can be somehow treated and be source of water in washing stations. These integrations and rationalizations are the way to go in designing a pandemic responsive city and also forwarding resilient and green recovery. Next slide, please. Looking in all these socioeconomic impacts, both coming from the climate trees and the pandemic, there are some entry points that we can explore to forward resilient and green recovery. Number one, improving the delivery of basic social services in context of water management, provision of adequate housing. By that, we mean not only of space, but also climate resilient, and investing to internet connectivity. Number two, optimizing our public spaces in, let's say, in context of developing networks instead of siloed road system and parks, and promoting sustainable business models in context of support to small and medium enterprises, as well as the informal sector in participating in virtual spaces, encouraging business investment through incentivizing the green business models, and welcoming the participation of the private sector to invest to smart technology conversion of our public infrastructure. Next slide, please. When we, next slide, next slide, please. When we say resilient and green recovery, how exactly are we doing it? Through the B Group D project, or MOOC is being supported to identify its recovery initiatives that will be included in their investment plan. In a larger context, resilient and green recovery, or RGR, does not intend to depart from the development goals of the city, but to align with their development goals pre-pandemic, while on the same time facilitating and pinning down the important development issues that is different from the response work, meaning your rapid short-term initiatives to alleviate the hazard, and setting up the city's return to sustainable development track, meaning its balanced growth on socially, economically, and environmentally. In a continuum, we situate RGR as the process of understanding the important impacts that will retire as new realities supersede it. And those new realities, as they say, new normal, that will still facilitate the city's balanced development. These include how to institutionalize responses from the pandemic restrictions and requirements, and propagation of the new methods, let's say your e-learnings, your e-registrations, and provisions of spaces when we need to slow down again with the same public health concern. Next slide, please. Here are some fundamental pointers on recovery work. The need to always build back better and safer, doing away from our business as usuals and go for the innovative options, capture the main risks and vulnerabilities of the people and of course the spaces, recover together in multiple level and scales from blocks to villages to cities, to do resource mobilization planning. Let's work internally, proper prioritization of funds in the city, and explore all other financing windows available to us. Take on the cues of your response work. Let's say the vendors in the market on wheels can form the market association of that permanent city satellite market, and engage groups and agencies on the same work to develop long-term partnerships. Next slide, please. Last year, UN Habitat and the World Health Organization released a guide on integrating health to spatial planning. It focuses on health as an input, meaning a consideration of planning and an outcome, a benefit from the planning work. It emphasized 5 points. One, compact spaces. This includes accessibility and availability of services with ease in the shortest possible time. socially inclusive spaces, the role of public and open spaces as social equalizer, where there is no discrimination for the vulnerable groups, better connected spaces, emphasis on developing network of roads and in spaces being no place and no people unserved, and resilient to climate change and natural hazards. This is addressing the multiple risks on the city through the design, not only on pandemic but also the ever-present climate impacts. And institutionally integrated, this calls for the collaboration and convergence of efforts that can streamline investments that reflects the idea of whole of nation approach. Next slide, please. Here are some photos of the City Technical Working Group during one of the workshop and mentoring sessions under the B Group D project. This project is also in partnership with the National Economic and Development Authority, Department of Interior and Local Government, Department of Health, and the Climate Change Commission. These national government offices, with the leadership of the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, are capturing the experience of Ormoc City and Tagum City, also one of our partner cities, that reflects the vertical and the horizontal concerted efforts to define and operationalize resilient and green recovery. Next slide, please. Operationally, B Group D project have designed two series of activities. One is the city level workshop on green recovery plan. This includes all the offices and units of the city, which focus on the impacts and opportunities across different services that can be offered by the city. Here are some ideas from the workshop. Next slide, please. On these projects, these emphasize the value of optimization in two fronts, the virtual space and the physical space. This looks on accessibility as the key driving factor, and with the new infrastructure gaps provided, there are now opportunities for us to design it with green approaches. Next slide, please. On this set of projects in economic stability, this looks on institutional level on fiscal management or austerity measures employed by the city. This also includes upgrading internal strengths to continue business operations and reviewing policy levers on ease of doing business and its incentivization, especially on green business models. Next slide. On three important areas on agriculture, water, and housing, we can see that the concern of the city is still to ensure food security in all its sources and stocks, and securing its water and creating alternative sources through rain capture, for example, and catching up on housing backlogs. Next slide. On these anchor open and public infrastructure projects, we can exhibit climate adaptive and pandemic responsive designs that supports other outcomes or benefits. One, better social service delivery and economic support, achievement of the spatial development plan, creating the multiple nodes of urbanization as their development spatial development goal, take on parallel issues of city management like traffic management, and taking on public participation in innovative approaches like natural and nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. The second activity is a series of mentoring and design charrettes that looks on the role of public and open spaces as local and stimulus of resilient and green recovery. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Focusing on the urban systems, Ormoc City Technical Working Group identified 5 areas of urban design projects. Number 1, the mangrove parks that look on its rehabilitation and protection to keep the site as a natural barrier to storm surges and provide spaces for livelihood and health. Number two, the neighborhood scale design in the immediate expansion area. This can provide a case for how spaces interact and implement with public participation and develop projects that control land use changes. And linear parks development, these are cases of transforming existing access roads to cater more functions demanded by the pandemic. Plaza redevelopment, this sets the tone of parks and open spaces development in the city, highlighting its water management strategy. Road network development, it intends to reclaim the streets as part of the public realm and forward the bundled development of roads, sidewalks, and drainage systems, and develop a rational linkage of spaces. Next slide, please. Here are some design ideas in road networks and its interaction to building design. In areas of adaptation, we can explore designing buildings with arcades and water collection system. On roads that are integrated to water collection system that capture surface runoff and flooding. We can also station market on wheels or structures for vendors in the informal economy, trees for temperature regulation. In areas of mitigation, we can explore buildings, designing with passive cooling and better ventilation to reduce energy requirement. And in roads, again, presence of trees as GHG sink and bike lanes to promote active mobility and use of renewable energy in transportation and public fixtures. Next slide. In context of pandemic, we can transform roads to include hand washing stations, market on wheels and open air dining areas, adequate spaces for walking and biking, and safe public transportation. Next slide, please. In waterfronts, we can explore the natural solutions like expanding the mangrove forest that can both function in terms of adaptation as a natural barrier and to storm surge and wave and mitigation as additional forest sink. Adaptation-wise, linear parks with water management design connected to the drain system below road network is still applicable while providing these spaces for biking to reduce GHG emissions. Next slide, please. With the same climate resilient design, we can transform built up spaces to pandemic responsive, providing access to goods through market on wheels, policy on pedestrianization to maximize space for movement through walking and cycling, and deliberate inclusion of spaces for hand washing. Next slide, please. There are a lot of opportunities to integrate these designs into open and public spaces that can influence also the building design up across the city scale or the city form. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. To conclude, we wish to emphasize some points. Number one, climate change and pandemic impacts had to be situated in a planning continuum of response, recovery, and sustainable development that considers health as an input and an outcome. These impacts can be integrated and have to be approached in totality. We can extend our risk assessment tools to include public health concern. This is currently also being developed under the project, which benefits are deliberately planned. Understanding impacts to the vulnerable will keep our design and initiatives grounded that will elicit support of the people. Develop resource mobilization plan, invest on projects with multiple and parallel benefits, explore funding outside of the city, and designing open spaces, appreciating it as a locale and stimulus of your resilient and green recovery will drive. It will also drive the social equity of the uneven and differentiated impacts of climate risk and pandemic. And through resilience and green recovery planning process and design and urban designing as a tool, the same problem detection and project development can be replicated in other cities and planning units. Thank you for your participation in this session. You can reach the B Group D project and UN Habitat through our website and social media channels. Thank you. Over to you, Louis.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Ben. I love the visuals. So it made us understand better the various strategies on how cities can be designed in the post-pandemic context. So hopefully through this experience in Ormoc City, we can consolidate the framework of resilient and green recovery, the RGR planning at a national level, and then cascade it to other cities and municipalities in the Philippines, and who knows, no, perhaps in other countries as well. So again, thank you, Aya and Ben, for your presentations. So a virtual round of applause to our speakers. You may click the clap icon in our Zoom. So now we have some 15 minutes now for our Q&A portion. So we are now opening the virtual floor to our audience for the Q&A portion. So for those who wanted to ask questions, now kindly raise your hand to be recognized and then wait for us to call you. Or alternatively, you may also type your questions in our chat box. So do we have any questions from our participants right now? Participants list. Questions from our participants? Okay, if not, I do have a question for our speakers. So first with Aya, in your presentation, you mentioned that at the start of your slides, you mentioned that one of the goals of the research is to, of course, to document and then to build on, and lastly is to co-create possible solutions, for possible solutions to the problems being experienced by the urban poor groups. So perhaps you could share some updates on what happened after the adaptive capacities research. Were there institutions stopped? Were there other partners involved after the research?
Yes. Hi. So yeah, we were able to use the results of this research for other projects. One of our partner organizations, the Philippine Action for Community-Led Initiatives, or PACSI, they conducted the Cities Alliance project, wherein they were able to provide support for communities by building hand washing facilities, giving out COVID-19 sanitation kits, and among other forms of support to the communities that need it. We were also able to partner with a local university wherein the students were divided into groups, and each group was assigned a community, and the results of this research was presented to them, and from the results of this research and with further discussions with the communities, they were able to come up with different projects such as livelihood programs, the livelihood programs, also different urban gardening strategies were suggested, were presented to these communities, and so they were able to form modules that the communities could follow, and even after the partnership with the local university ended, because some communities, they didn't have the funds at the present to they don't have the funds at present to conduct these, to follow the whatever was suggested in the module. But once they are able to get funds, they it they can then implement the projects proposed by the students. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good though, because one of the goals of the research is not only to extract data from the community, because as we know, most of, if not all of, some of the researches are very extractive in nature. External researchers come into the community, they gather data, and then afterwards, the data are not received or validated at the community level, and the communities are left with without any updates on the research. At least we were able to support, no, from what data we've gathered, we were able to support the locally led initiatives. So now, thank you for that, Aya. My next question is addressed to Sir Ben. Again, I'm interested in the next steps. Similar to my question in Aya, I believe the RGR framework, the Resilient and Green Recovery Planning Framework, is being piloted in two cities. So we have Ormoc City in the Visayas region and Tagum City in Mindanao. So once the exploratory phase is done, no, what are the some of the plans of CEU and Habitat or the DSUD for in terms of institutionalization, whether at city level, at national level, and of course, how can these RGR plans and policies be felt at the community level? So,
Yes. Thank you, Louis. In terms of institutionalization, the framework and the process, actually currently with the project, we are also supporting the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development in crafting the climate resilient human settlements framework and their resilient and green recovery agenda. This document will be developed coming from the inspiration and experiences of Ormoc and Tagum as we do this. And once this national document will be formalized and legalized by the department, this framework will guide all the local government units in the country to do the same process, to take on the same principles on their development agenda, on their city level development agenda. In terms of how the planning process and the participation of the masses in the planning work, no, we are doing design sessions as these should be first the design before any project. During the designing stage of the project, the participation of the people should be ensured, like what we did actually in the first phase of the project when we developed the Ormoc urban waterscape. We did series of designing sessions with the community. As for our current situation now with the COVID-19 restrictions, we are still exploring how the designing sessions and project ideation, how we can mature the project idea with the community is well, it's a challenge for everyone now. Maybe Tompe can share us how you also see the on the ground implementation of collaborative designing and planning. But yes, the participation and inputs of the community will always be there. It should be ensured and it should be led by the city that we are working on.
yeah, so we can totally relate with regards to the participation of community members because in the past, because Tampe is highly involved in community work, we usually do field work with them, and it's chaotic. It's fun and chaotic at the same time. But right now, because of the pandemic restrictions, we're having a hard time gathering them. No, mass gatherings are limited, are prohibited by the LGUs, and so we can't really say harness the full participation of community members right now. But I believe we believe in Tampay that there are also other ways. Right now we're devising say strategies on how um, to harness their participation. We're doing blended learning strategies now, similar with the strategies of DepEd. No? We do we do partly Zoom meetings with them, no, to get their inputs, and then we also do limited face-to-face interactions with communities. We believe it can be done. It's just that it would somehow require more time and I could say more resources to be able to fully harness the participation of community members in this type of people-led processes. So thank you for that, Ben. Are there questions from our audience? Oh, there's a question in our chat, but it's already answered by Aya. The question goes, Sonia, would you like to elaborate on your question, or Aya, would you like to elaborate on your answer? The question is in line with the first research question. Was the study of community situation prior to COVID a part of community profiling? Was there a comparative study done? Yeah.
Should I repeat the question?
Yes, sure, Sonia. Go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My question was basically because the research question very clearly said that I think it was more to relate after post-COVID situation. So I was just curious if because it was mentioned in the data collection method that a community profiling was done. So I was just curious if it was a part of if the community pre-COVID was studied and if it was compared in a before-after situation. So I think I already answered that most of the data came from the community members itself, and you did not have an in-depth study at this level. So yeah, I actually got the answer to my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Sonia. Any other questions from our participants? So if there is no more questions, I would like to request one of my classmates in CERT, the University of the Philippines School of Urban and Regional Planning, Sonia, to provide a synthesis of our session for today. So Sonia is currently completing her PhD in Urban and Regional Planning at CERT. So Sonia.
Again, good afternoon, everyone. Well, we already said that I'm taking my PhD here, and I've been living in the Philippines for the last 3 years. So I'm sort of 15% Filipino by now, but I'm from Bangladesh originally. So whenever you're talking about community resilience or disaster management or coping with disaster, I can some way or the other relate to my country because we are also prone to natural disasters, if you might be aware of. So thank you for the presentation, Sir Ben and Aya both. I am aware of what Tampay does here, so I can relate to your studies and your researches. What I gathered from both your presentations is, we can see how important it is integrate the strategies or facts that we normally keep on discussing in our daily life that would ultimately support and even enhance the adaptive capacities of urban poor communities, like simply creation of green spaces or rules and regulations in building houses. But one thing that stands out for me personally is social accountability, or the Bayanihan, as I have learned after coming here, which talks about increased awareness on good governance, which is very important if we're talking about community strategies for resilience. Also, it's such a crucial point for people to be aware of their surroundings or whatever opportunities that they're exposed to. A few things that I saw came up, they were common in both the presentations. It was emphasis on the vulnerable group as our targets and design of green and open spaces, both of which are actually target-oriented approaches and attempts to stabilize or even equalize any adverse impacts from climate change and whatsoever. And also the participation from stakeholders in these trying times of COVID-19, as we can see, when individuals or communities they're constantly finding ways to cope with the unavoidable scenario, we can see that the participation from stakeholders or even we might say intervention how it can level up the already existing people-led approaches or people-led incentives. Of course, then again, it pertains to the fact that there has to be a recognition from these relevant organizations in the process to further support the social capital sector, which we keep on saying when we talk about community, that it's one of their most important, and it's actually for their first line of defense, their social capital and their social ties, which we also have learned in our process of learning about planning tourism. And last but never the least, the integration of climate change issues, which was base of our second presentation, and solutions in the possible sustainable planning concerns that we have to actually detect and then analyze and include it in our guiding principles. So yeah, that's part of what I figured out from both the presentations. And thank you so much for guiding us and taking us into detail of your researches and case studies. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Sonia. So 4 points: social accountability, the concept of bayanihan, participation of vulnerable groups, and of course, vulnerable groups and other stakeholders, and of course, the integration of climate change plans. So we hope you learned a lot in our session today entitled Planning for Resilience in Vulnerable Communities in the Philippines. We hope to see you in the other sessions of the Innovate for Cities Conference 2021. So thank you and have a good day, everyone. Thank you, Sir Ben and Aya, for the presentations, and to all the participants who
Thank you,
attended
Yinda,
today's
Yana.
session.
Thank you, Miss Lara.